huge fan of yours, so this is pretty awesome for me.
I'm a fan of yours. I'm a fan of you. You've interviewed literally all my travel heroes. It's so cool to see.
Well, let's do this. Before we find out some of your big travel stories, tell us first about Uprocks and what you guys are doing there.
Yeah, so Uprocks is a digital platform, started as mostly entertainment leaning. And then a couple years ago, actually like 5 years ago, I started the life section. I emailed the people who ran the company just like a cold email with no intro, no knowing someone in the business, and just said, hey, I'm a award-winning travel writer, site all the time. I think you would do well with travel. And after a couple months, I got them to agree, and then they hired me to run travel and drinks and food and lifestyle stuff. And so it's evolved from there. And then last year we were sold to Warner Music, which is a cool partnership and has made us even more music leaning than we were before, and has protected us from things like this economic downturn that we're in right now. So it has been a good thing all the way around.
Yes, elephant in the room. Let's talk about this. How are you? Family safe? You guys are good?
Yeah, family is safe. Things are good right now, but I think it's such a weird, evolving day-to-day situation where everything can change like that. And it does. It does. My partner's father had been going. They're Iranian immigrants. They came here during a war. They're the classic American story. She's a refugee. She's a wartime refugee, and grew up during a war and escaped the United States and is a citizen and a taxpayer and all these wonderful things. No side of the aisle could be upset with her and her family. And her father has been driving to downtown Los Angeles from Orange County for 25 years, 6 days a week, to run a clothing store. And the second that, his margins are so tight and that business is so tough, and he's dealing primarily with non-English speakers in an area where people don't have a lot of disposable income. The second coronavirus hit, he shut down his business of 25 years. Her mom is out of work. And so these are some of those human stories that we see for those people who don't work online, who can't transfer that work that easily. There's, the impact is immediate and swift and painful.
How are you feeling on the travel front? I mean, just granted, we know that the travel industry as a whole has been decimated, and we're all kind of at a standstill in life on so many levels. But how do you have thoughts about where we go or what's going to happen next?
I do have thoughts. I will tell you that one thing about a discussion with me, and it goes for this one, especially when we start to talk about what's coming after coronavirus, is that you have to be willing to talk about like my entire construction of the universe, essentially, right? Which is pretty involved. I think, if we're going to talk about what's going to come out of Corona, I think there is going to be a philosophical shift, one that I'm really hopeful for. And I'll explain the couple tiers that I see it on. And now, on one hand, I'm just a person speculating on your podcast wildly about what might happen after this. On the other hand, my day job is to chart the movements of people online and to try to figure out which direction they're heading and kind of where the tide is turning. So it's something that I find myself at least relatively adept at. But, here are some of the things I've tracked. I think that there's going to be this aspect of young people who say, my parents were knocked out in 2008. Their retirements get obliterated. Now it's 2020, and the first little bankroll I've made for myself has gotten flattened. Okay, I'm going to seize the day. I've also seen, the third piece is, by receiving a stimulus check, I've also seen that some level of universal income can work in this country. Whether that's emergency based or whether that's completely income based or whatever, I've seen that it can work, and that it is not going to bankrupt the entire country. So between those three things, I think there's going to be some aspect of like, let's seize the motherfucking day and go out and live our best lives and experience some stuff, because the world tomorrow is not promised to us. And I think that's a very valid takeaway from all this. I also think there's going to be a real push for people to go, look, I need to secure myself. Maybe I'm in a different generation, or I have kids, or whatever, I need to make sure I'm secure. I'm going to make sure that I know the area around where I live. I'm going to make sure that I know before I go to Hawaii, if I'm from Southern California, I'm going to make sure I know the northern Malibu beaches too, because there's so much beauty in this country. And for me, I started my travel career as a hitchhiker around the United States. So for me, I've been advocating travel around the United States my entire life. It's an important piece of the puzzle in my world. So those are two of the things I see coming out of it.
And I'm not going to let that pass me. I'm definitely going to get back to your hitchhiking stories because I have. But I do agree with you. I do believe it's going to be very localized when the gates are opened, if you will, and people focusing, which I also think, like you said, is a good thing, because I do think a lot of Americans take for granted the incredible country that we are living in. I want to bring up one point to you and see if maybe you think this is actually going to shift, because I heard you on the Wild Ideas Worth Living podcast, and I've heard you other places even talk about this, as far as like how travelers have turned into, as opposed to really appreciating the moments and really being travelers. The recent kind of movement has been like, well, how do I monetize this? And how can I stay traveling and get my blog going and, blah, 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 as opposed to just enjoying the freaking journey, man. Do you think that's going to shift where a lot of these bloggers are going to be kind of knocked off, or do you think it's going to be free range again?
I mean, content's only going to get easier to produce, but I do think during this time when people who are staying home all of a sudden say like, wow, I can have access to celebrities. I can, we have like the biggest musicians in the world doing live concerts for free on Instagram. I hope that there will be this reminder that you have to create something of substance to actually matter in people's lives and for them to bring you places. I think that there will be a pinch on the people who have just, played the social media machine right and don't necessarily have something to say. And I think there should be a pinch on those people. Social media, like every industry, expanded really wide, really fast. And we didn't slow down to say, well, does every single person who we consider a travel influencer have a voice that really needs to be heard when it comes to travel? I've dealt with that my whole career. I've talked before about the fact that, I really started out as someone who loved traveling, and I had gone to, I had traveled the world and was working for glossy magazines before I ever would have thought to start something of my own. Whereas maybe that monetize, if you're thinking just of making money, that probably wasn't the policy, because I grew up in the golden age of blogs. I could have started a blog as a 22-year-old and really done well at that time, because there wasn't a ton of those. So I'm not saying that I've taken the right way, but I do think like slowing down and understanding what travel's about and adding some layers of nuance to that conversation is going to be important for people who want to be involved in the conversation.
Yeah, dude, this is why I like you, and I'm excited to welcome you into the Travel With Me community. It's that deep sense of travel, not necessarily trying to figure out how do I monetize every little thing I do or where I go.
Right. Like I can't leave my door anymore without making money from it somehow. And I think that ultimately is going to be a failure, because it's not, to create a product that I want other people to consume. For me, I have to really think about it on a deep level. It's like creating a book or writing a script or whatever. And so I don't always want to be kind of throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks.
Yeah, and I'll say this, and I'll be completely, on the real with this, is there's absolutely been times in my life as a professional and traveler that I did think the other way. And so much so, like when I left my job as a talent agent and I started traveling in Australia, I was literally signing deals with people because I was like, well, I can sell this show when I get back, as opposed to enjoying it. And I look back at it now going, what was I thinking? Just go grab a beer and shut up, dude. Anyway, we can't talk enough about where we are now without knowing where you've really been. So let's put you up on the screen there. Make sure you get your social handles also for everyone to enjoy. And then let's dive into who you are. You mentioned this hitchhiking thing. So you grew up in Oregon, correct?
I grew up in Oregon, yeah.
And you alluded to in our conversation just a second ago about your first real big trip was hitchhiking around the States.
Yeah. Yeah. So when I was 19 years old, I all my friends. This was the era of college loans. This is when when I went to college was when colleges, the federal government was loaning people money. It really spiked if you look at it in 1999, 1998. There was this massive spike in college loans. The federal government was excited to loan people money. Retail was starting to collapse, and if you want to get really back behind the real reason of it all, we needed a retail bailout, and so we loaned a bunch of money to the absolute worst spenders in the world, irresponsible 18-year-olds. And those irresponsible 18-year-olds took on the burden of supporting the retail industry with our horrible purchasing decisions. So I wasn't quite ready to do that, and I was out of money, and all my friends were going off to different places. They were going to Oxford, they were going to Australia, they were going to Italy, they were going to Spain. And I was like, well, I want to have a semester abroad too, but I can't afford the semester part. So I dropped out of college, and there are a couple things that I would refer all your readers to because they still exist, all your listeners to. They're amazing. The first one was in the 60s, like around at the end of the 60s and into the 70s, there was this bus called the Green Tortoise, and it started up in Oregon where I'm from, and it's now based in San Francisco. And it's called a sleeper coach. It's like an old International Forester bus. It's painted green, and it drives at night, and you wake up at a different national park. And so it's a really, really cool bus, very, very hippie-ish. And I took that as a 19-year-old. I took it across the country from California, from San Francisco to New York City. And that took 3 weeks. And it was amazing. I mean, I was 19 years old. I was single. I was in love with life. And I got on there, and there was not a single other American on the bus. So all my friends were on their semester abroad getting drunk with kids from Wisconsin. And I was the one who was still in the United States meeting people from Sweden. There were 47 or 27 Swedish au pairs on the bus. There were Australians. It was amazing.
And you were the only
So I took
American.
that bus. What's that?
You were the only American?
I was the only American. It was incredible experience. So I took that bus for a couple weeks, ended out in New York, and then started hitchhiking. And then there was this amazing thing that Greyhound did. 3 months, all the Greyhound buses you could take for $99. And I got that, which was just even then. I mean, I'm sure inflation has changed a little, but even in 1999, that was just an insane deal.
Seems like
So
a good deal for them to think about now.
yeah. So between busing and the Greyhound, I would plan my schedule out so that I would hop on the Greyhound at 9 o'clock at night and go to a city 10 hours away and sleep, on the bus all night. I've always been an easy sleeper, and then wake up in a new place. So between all those things and then hitchhiking, I traveled around the country for 4 months solid.
Did you have things you wanted to see, or you just kind of kept going with the flow?
I've always been a bounce around traveler. I mean, I've done 65 countries bouncing around, but I really bounced around the United States. Like I was quite random. I found a silent retreat in Kentucky where you go and you agree that you won't talk. And it's with Trappist monks, which are kind of like the Buddhist version of Catholics. And it's this monastery. Like the Trappists make beer, they make sausage, and they don't talk. That's their trio. And I went and stayed with them for a week. I worked at a hostel in Miami. I was just everywhere. So it was really, really.
Were you just finding this stuff from just like asking around, like because there's no internet at the time?
There was internet. It was vague, but it was just there was so much like. One of the coolest things about youth, I think people miss the number one coolest thing about youth is like not knowing it better and allowing your life to just be totally kinetic is like the coolest thing. And my life was just completely kinetic. Someone would say like, oh, you know what's cool is New Orleans is cool. And I'd hop on an overnight bus for New Orleans. And in New Orleans, I found a guy who had a barber shop. And I would sweep up the hair from the floor of his barbershop every night. That was my job. and then I would be allowed in exchange to roll out my bedroll and sleep on the floor of the barbershop each night. When he came in every morning, he would lock me in at night. And then when he came in every morning, he would open it, and I'd be out, and I'd go experience my day. And he was a partier, so we stayed out late. It was great.
That's crazy. Yeah,
Yeah.
you use the old-fashioned method of just kind of talking to people, right? That's the way it should be. That's what I like to.
Yeah, I still
Where
use
can I
that
go? What should
method.
I do?
Yeah, I still use that method. In fact, when I go to a city, the first thing I do is start asking people, where do I eat? And my secret is, when when something comes up 3 or 4 times, that's how you know where to go. But the thing you have to do, this is the real key. The thing you have to do is you have to say to people, not where should I eat? Because you immediately identify yourself as a tourist. You say, where would you eat? And
Yeah,
if you get 3 people mentioning the same place there, then that's where to go.
yeah. You always want to go where they want to go, not where the tourist goes.
Yeah, exactly.
And
Exactly.
I heard somewhere too on a podcast or something I read about you that you normally don't even take a camera with you.
I often don't. I often don't. You know, lately it's been a little more, but I had gone a long stretch there where I literally didn't bring a camera anywhere. And part of it was like I at that time, writing was still completely viable on its own without saying like I have to be a 360-degree content creator.
Hmm.
And my thought process was like, I want to experience things not through the remove of a lens. There is something in a lens that's like, well, how am I presenting this to others versus how alive am I? And if you look at some of the adventures I've done, like buying a boat in Vietnam and sinking in this boat and bailing it out and making it, over the course of days and days down the Mekong Delta, it's not something that you feel comfortable to do if you have a ton of camera
Well said. So let's get to
equipment.
that because yeah, I love it because you keep just dropping nuggets of little things that I'm making notes of and wanting to get back to with stories that I know you have to tell. So 14 months though around the States hitchhiking. And the
No,
reason,
it's about 4 months around the States.
sorry, 4 months. 14 months is what I want to get to. See, I'm already ahead of it because
Okay.
I already know where I want to
Yeah.
get to. See? Don't worry, people. We're getting some good stuff. I still do find it really fascinating and also really, I guess, commendable that you chose to do the States first. And I like that for the fact that, again, like you, I like to tell people that if you've never been to Sedona or if you've never been to Joshua Tree
Right.
or some of these other magical places in the States that, again, I think are going to have a really big resurgence in the next year. We have a pretty amazing place in our own backyard.
We
So,
do. We do. I think there is so much natural beauty in the United States. There's people coming from all over the world to see it. And then you meet someone who is only interested in, they come up to you and they go like, oh my gosh, these red rocks in the center of Australia, Uluru, which I've been to and is profound. But is it more profound than Monument Valley, which you have up on your screen right now? I'm not sure about that. There's a lot of beauty to be found here in the United States. If you look at this image that you put together, and thank you for putting that effort into our conversation. On the right you have the Masai Mara, and you have Cambodia, and on the left you have two United States destinations that are equally, exotic, fascinating, and one is Monument Valley, and the other is the Redwoods.
yeah, I kind of like the juxtaposition. Thank you for acknowledging that, actually. Well, I wanted to ask before we kind of get off the US trip, I wanted to ask, was there one place from that trip that really surprised you?
Yes, there were quite a few, but I would say the biggest one. Well, one thing that trip did was key me into the American Southwest, which is if someone comes to me and says, "Hey, where do I start in the United States?" I always say the American Southwest. Canyon de Chelly, which is a Navajo Canyon where you can rent a horse and ride horses up the canyon for 5 hours at a time, 3 days at a time. You could do overnight trips in Canyon de Chelly if you want. Is one of the most special places on earth. I've gone back there. I went there as a 19-year-old. I was traveling around the country and I rented a horse and I rode up the canyon, and I've gone back every 3 or 4 years since. It's such a special place. So the American Southwest just staggered me. Like it keyed me into how magical New Mexico is long before that kind of hit the traveler's circuit. You know, someone the other day in a podcast was like, have you been to any of these dark sky parks that everyone's buzzing about now? And the newest dark sky park in New Mexico is one that I visited extensively, 20 years ago. So I have, it just wasn't named that. But the whole American Southwest, I would say. And then the other one is Kentucky. Ending up in Kentucky to visit those Trappist monks. Kentucky was an area where I was doing a lot of hitchhiking. And to see, now I come with a lot of privilege, obviously. I'm a white male, and there is all sorts of privilege of traveling around the South that comes with that. I'm very aware of that. But with that said, my experience in Kentucky was that I got all of that generosity and I got all of that warmth that people talk about with the South that I hadn't really experienced firsthand. So that was pretty thrilling.
Awesome. I haven't had a chance to go to Kentucky yet, but I could definitely get a couple drinking lessons in there. Well,
if you can,
go ahead.
If you go in the fall, the air smells like brown sugar, and everything, like bourbon is just in the air. Like it seems to. The one thing I always say about Kentucky in the fall, especially rural Kentucky in the fall, is I've never felt so comfortable in my own skin as I did in Kentucky. Like, and I mean that not like, oh, I felt confident or something, but literally like my skin never itched. It never like perspirated unnaturally. Everything just felt like really comfortable. Really? Kentucky in October.
Kentucky in October. That should be an ad campaign. Kentucky in October. All right, we'll see you in Kentucky in October. Amazing. So what I've read and what I know is that at some point you connect to somebody to start, I don't know if you wrote about your travels from this time hitchhiking or you start writing about it, right? And then somehow you get connected to some magazines. And where does the trip come to then start traveling for 14 months? How did that come together?
It was, it was the same way. It was completely, I was that person who always wanted to trade in experiences above currency, and experiences were always going to be the asset that I had to my name. And I was 24, 25 years old, and I had been teaching kindergarten. And when I was in college, I had dropped out, but written for our school newspapers. So I had some idea of how to do that, and writing while you're traveling adds some kind of nice backbone to things. And there was a woman who ran a Orange County glossy magazine whose kids I taught at this school, and she knew I was going away for a big trip, and she said, well, why don't you write for the magazine while you're away? And at this time, like the only way to get internet on the road, Wi-Fi wasn't so big. It was 2003. Wi-Fi existed, but I wasn't going to travel with a laptop. Is often there were like coin machines that you would put money into, or like you'd go to an internet cafe and you'd rent out a space. So I would write my column on the road, and it did give a nice kind of like meter and rhythm to the entire trip.
So before that setup, you were just going, but this kind of gave it a little more structure and format for you too.
Yeah, but again, it's that backwards mindset of monetizing things, because literally I was going to go no matter what. I was on the road, like that was my mentality. The year before, I had done the exact same thing. I had earned a bunch of money, or what was a bunch of money for me at the time, and spent 2 months in Fiji and New Zealand, and that was just the rhythm of how I was living my life in my 20s, which is just save up as much as you can and then burn through it till you get to zero, and then go home and do it again,
Repeat. Rinse, repeat, do it again. Yeah, I read an interesting thing about you where you have, I guess, a fascination for like transportation, right? So tell us how this happened. So you embark on this, I think it's a 14-month trip you took, right?
Yeah.
You spent a lot of time.
Yes. A lot of time in Africa, a lot of time in Southeast Asia, and then a fair bit of time in Australia. And I think two things happened on that trip that were really special. First of all, was that I figured out I wanted to control my mode of transport. And the biggest thing was in Eastern Africa, seeing exactly like how sharp the dichotomy was at that time between tourists and people who were actually living in communities and working in communities and outside of the tourist network. And there were people who I would see going to East Africa on vacation, who literally wouldn't have a single transaction that wasn't within the confines of the tourist network. They were, they were paying guides. They were going to restaurants that their guides recommended. They were driving in cars that their guides owned. They just weren't doing anything that was just completely their own and not part of that system. So I bought a Nissan Patrol, and which is just a big like Land Cruiser type car. And the best thing happened with it was that I know nothing about cars, and it was, can we curse on here?
Yeah.
It was a utter and complete piece of shit, like the worst car, and that was so good because I was constantly having to repair it, and having to repair it put me in local communities. So by having to repair it, I was constantly having conversations in local communities, talking with people, saying, why the fuck do these tires keep popping, et cetera, et cetera. And it just gave me this massive locus of control where I could say, like, tomorrow we're going here and the next day we're going here. I started driving through all of the national parks in Kenya and Tanzania, and so I was self-guided, which they discourage you from doing but let you do. And it was great. It was incredible to guide yourself on safari, because most of those safaris have such a time pressure on them that they see a lion, they drive up to the lion, and then they drive away. Like I checked off the box. And what we were doing was I would drive up to a lion, and I would park, and I would spend the next 6 or 7 hours reading a book, watching a lion, which is literally my childhood dream. And by doing that, by slowing down in that way and really being on that forefront conversation of what became known around 2008 as slow travel, I was able to really absorb those animals that I idolized. And then it manifested in different places in different ways. I'm a surfer like you. So in Australia, it meant having a van and being able to surf at different breaks. And in Cambodia, in that photo you see, it meant having a bike and being able to bike around different places. And in Vietnam, it meant buying a small boat. I always cringe when I say buying a boat because you get the idea of someone who summers in Nantucket. I bought a boat called a Zampan for about $95. And I rode down the Mekong Delta for days and days. And those experiences really happen when you control how you get around.
I want to go back to this picture with the Maasai, and for everyone on the podcast,
Yeah.
check out the video as well, because we have great pictures of Steve for a bunch of his different adventures on this picture here. So you talk about driving through Africa. You're talking about doing safaris on your own. So I think of myself in the first place. I'm like, well, that's just crazy. Like, I would be kind of freaked out. Like, you're just guiding yourself, just kind of like happy-go-lucky? Were there moments you're like, holy shit, like I'm in the middle of this, or here's a stampede? Like, were there moments of kind of riding that wave, or you just kind of happy-go-lucky the whole time?
No, there were huge moments of that. And I think, my problem in life, and also my asset, is probably that I embrace that so willingly and thrive under those conditions. But there were big moments of that. So one of the ones that was the most wild was, people don't know this, and maybe this loophole has been closed, but at the time when you were waiting for your visa to process and you were driving your own car between the Masai Mara in Kenya and the Serengeti in Tanzania, you could actually park out in the open inside the national park and camp. And it was a weird kind of loophole. And you were actually camping at the guide station. And I remember one night I was camping there. I camped there for 2 nights. One night I was camping there, and you just heard like lions roaring, and it felt like they were next to you. And I had heard all these stories of, like, when you hear a lion really roar, it will feel like it's next to you. And don't worry, it's probably 5 miles away. And I remember saying, like, no big deal. It's probably 5 miles away. Next morning, I woke up and there was a wildebeest carcass about 7 feet from my tent. And I was like, oh, in this case, the lion was right next to me. It was right there. So there were some moments like that that were really eye-opening. And then there was moments, more graphically and perhaps more interestingly, where I was confronted with conversations that weren't necessarily being had in the same way in 2006 about the privilege that I had as a Western traveler in Eastern Africa. So when I was driving through southern Tanzania and northern Mozambique, those areas can grow tons and tons, literally 2 tons of cashews in one uncultured, unplanted acre. So just completely feral. They can grow 2 tons of cashews a year. Oh, it can grow all those cashews, right? But they had held up when I was there, they had held up the cashew harvest because there was an election. And this is the sort of like macroeconomic stuff you don't really see as a traveler. But they had held it up because there was an election. And because of that, a lot of men my age were committing crimes. And so when I had a couple problems with crime and I had to defend myself by standing up with a machete and saying to someone like, look, this car and what's in it are all I have. You have to go through me and this machete if you want to take something from me. Those were the moments that, first of all, like they made me understand my own strength as a man, but also they made me realize, like, the true depth of that. There, but for the grace of God, go I. Like, you couldn't fault someone trying to steal something to keep their family alive when the whole livelihood they had of harvesting cashews had been frozen by a government that they felt totally out of touch with. So it's a really interesting thing to wrestle with in Eastern Africa.
That's pretty deep. And it's definitely pretty heavy to even think about years later. You shared a story with me then when we spoke, I guess it's like a week or so ago on the phone, about a situation that happened that something was stolen from you. Where was that?
Yeah. So that was in Tanzania. That's this exact situation that I'm talking about. So what, you want me to retell you that story now?
Well, I do, sure.
Nice.
I think it's a good
So what happened was their young men were out of work because they couldn't harvest cashews. And I was on a beach and I was laying down and I heard rustling behind me. And at this time, I was traveling around the world for 14 months. So I had a camera. The camera cost $2,500. And I heard rustling behind me and I looked back and there was someone who was grabbing my camera out of my bag. And I hopped up and I chased him. And I chased him. We were on a small island. I chased him through the interior of the island and out on the beach for about 1.5 miles. And then he collapsed from exhaustion. And I must have been in the best shape of my life or had a lot of adrenaline going. I felt okay. And I tackled him. And then the whole situation pivoted. And what happened was the local villagers had heard all the screaming, realized what was going on. Someone had told them, someone had spread the word, and they came to attack him because he had stolen. And by stealing and me potentially sharing that with people, then it was going to hurt the tourism on their island, which was the only thing that they had at that economically depressed time. So they came to attack him. Now I was pivoted and I was protecting him from locals who were upset with him. And then the whole situation pivoted a third time as he told me what he was going through and how this the holdup on this harvest was not allowing him to feed his wife and sons. And how in this case, as much as I like to say, like, well, 2,500 is not that much for a camera, and it was my whole life savings, and I was traveling so close to the bone, and I didn't have a lot of money, and I didn't have a lot of financial breaks, no money from my parents, that kind of thing. It was a fucking lot to him. It was a fortune. And if he had gotten $100 for that $2,500 camera on the black market, it would have absolutely been worth the theft because he's supporting a family. So it pivoted again. And when I was put on a boat with him back to the mainland, where I was supposed to turn him over to the police constable, he and I ended up making a plan for how I would make sure that I didn't do that. How I didn't. So by the time the police met me at the boat as it disembarked and everyone had radioed to make sure this all worked out, they said, "Where's the guy who stole the camera from you? He was supposed to be on this boat with you." And I just said, "I don't know who he is or what you're talking about." and he wandered off. There was a bunch of people on the boat. It was a passenger vessel, so it was easy for him to blend into the crowd. Yeah, and so that was profound for me because it made me really look at things and go, wow, this is my prism, and I'm right by my angle, and this is the villager's prism, and they're right by their angle, and this is his prism, and he's right by his angle too. And I hadn't done that before in a way that was really substantive.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to see every different kind of side of it, and then some.
Yeah.
Everyone kind of has a dog in the fight, if you will.
Yeah, yeah. And if we could do that, right? If we could do that all the time when we travel, if we could say, wow, this is my mindset, and this is where the person who I'm talking to, and we might actually all have valid reasoning for what we're doing, I think we would be a lot further along culturally.
Who's to say where we're going from here? So, one question for you: where does this wanderlust come from for you? You've mentioned a couple of times growing up. I know you were like a fan of Nat Geo, and I know you kind of had this like dream to travel. But where does that come from as a kid? Is just kind of staring at Nat Geos, or anything that you have that kind of laid that ideas in your head?
I think that's as close as my family has to a family business is travel. Is my father he was actually a Catholic priest for 10 years. So he grew up very poor in New York City, the child of immigrants, Italian, obviously by my name Bramucci, and he he went to Venezuela for 10 years and was a priest there and traveled around Central America. My mother was living on a kibbutz in Israel and doing the whole 1960s hippie backpacking thing. And she was traveling the world. And then I have a sister who's 3 years older. And by the time I even got out of high school, it seemed like she had been everywhere. And she had lived in Italy, and she was living in Eastern Africa. So my initial, when I was ready to travel around the world, my initial trip was to go visit her in East Africa. Of course, by the time I planned the trip, she was already gone. But at that point, I was like, well, she went to East Africa. I want to go to East Africa. I want to see all these cool things too.
It's amazing. That obviously makes complete sense, right? It's what you know. You know what you know on that side.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. And you romanticize it, right? Like my mom was the best at all her travel stories were always about misadventure. They were always about things going sideways. And that became like my travel mantra more than anything else.
All the example, like getting through it, like whatever it is, that's just the lesson. That's whatever it is, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, all the first successes I had, stories that were sold to book anthologies or anything like that, were always, me bumbling through or looking like something of an asshole, but like making it through, just like being unprepared and I got caught in a flash flood in the Amazon, and I took this boat down the Mekong Delta, and I did these things and kind of eked it out. And I think that's always what my approach to travel is just like magic will happen to you on the road if you can go and you can be fearless.
And you survive. As long as you survive, there's a story to be told.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. There's no story.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, without some degree of risk, and I didn't have kids then. There was no, in climbing we call it a fall factor. There's no fall factor. Like what's the worst thing that's going to happen? Even if I die and there's only a couple people, no one relied on me.
There you go. Still part of the story. So from all these adventures, whether it's Amazon or the Mekong, and I've heard you share on other podcasts and some articles, these great stories, but do you have one or two that like maybe you haven't told in a couple of years, or you haven't even thought about that, even just from looking at some of these pictures or starting some of these conversations that come to you that like, you're like, wow, I've never sold this one as a story, but I've never told it.
Yeah, I do. I have a couple of those that are really special to me. I'll tell you a funny one first, and then I'll tell you a more emotional one. But one of the funniest ones and one of my favorites, and it says a lot to me about what travelers are like, is that, did you ever read the book The Beach?
The Beach, yes.
and it became a movie with Leonardo DiCaprio. So, you know, he's a little older than me, and I don't know your age, but for a certain generation, that was like the travel book. You know, for us, influencers weren't the travelers that we scorned. The people we scorned at that time, we scorned people who carried a lonely planet. And the beach has these giant rants about the lonely planet and having a lonely planet in your hand. And it was, you know, it was this ultimate conversation about who's a real traveler versus who's a tourist. So I love this book, The Beach. And when I went to Thailand, I discovered that every Thai marine park is actually you can camp at. They don't have any facilities, but you can camp on any island in a Thai marine park. Now you also can't fish because there's no fishing in Thai marine parks. But I went on a day tour like most tourists did, and all the tourists were kind of looking at me and saying like, "That's interesting. This guy's carrying a bag." And I hopped off the boat and I told the boat skipper I was hopping off, and I camped in one of the Thai marine parks for about 2 weeks for $1 a night. And what would happen is day trippers would come during the day, they'd stay for 2 hours, and then I would have the whole rest of the marine park to myself with the marine park staff, which was really cool. There was only 10 of them, first of all, so it was a small group, but they also like played soccer all day and you know, made crafts. And I remember one day there was this guy and he came up to me and he was like, "Steve, you know, I think of myself as really hardy and wanting to be involved in stuff." He goes, "Steve, come on, we're gonna go on a boat trip and we're gonna dig a well." And I remember going, "All right, I'm into this. I'm your well guy. I don't know anything about wells, but I'm gonna be." So we get these shovels, we go on a boat, and we hop off at this beautiful abandoned beach, and we start digging right by the water. And after about 10 minutes, I'm digging, and the waves are washing up and they're filling in my hole. And I look at the guy, and he runs the Thai Marine Park. He's about my age. And I was like, "Hey, man, are you sure this is where we're going to find a well? Like, it seems kind of close to salt water." And he goes, "Well, where else would you find a well?" And I like pulled back and I thought to myself, I don't know shit about wells. I was like, "All right, I guess I'll just keep digging." And we kept going, and I couldn't figure the thing out. We had this like, who's on first, you know, what's on second moment. And then finally I was like, "Man, I don't think we're going to find a well." And he plunges his shovel down and he goes, "There's the well." And we start pulling up massive whale bones. And I had misunderstood him with him speaking English, and I don't speak Thai. So, you know, it was on me much more than him. I was in his country. I had misunderstood him, and we were looking for a whale. And over the course of a day, we excavated an entire whale body, which he had seen it get beached the year before, and he had wanted the bones to hang up in the visitor center. And so we excavated a whale.
That's crazy.
Yeah. Where else would you dig for a well?
I mean, that's definitely something I've never done before. That's impressive.
It was a good miscommunication. Actually, this is my favorite. This is my favorite miscommunication. It's a little grim, but it's a good one. So in Cambodia, I was in Cambodia at the exact time where the people who were coming, who were kids during the Pol Pot regime, were you know, were my age. That's when I was in Cambodia, 2005, 2006. And then there was a younger generation of kids who were literally babies during the Pol Pot regime. And I went to an orphanage where these young people were living and trying to get, you know, job training and language training. And I taught English there. I taught English for a couple of days, and all they wanted was an American speaker to have conversation with. But one thing I found, because I didn't know anything about teaching English, was that if you start asking questions, other people start to repeat each other. Well, this was like the peak of 50 Cent's fame. And I remember one day I asked, I was like, you know, there hadn't been much conversation or dialogue in class. And I asked, I was like, who's your favorite musician? And the first kid raises his hand. He goes, "My favorite musician is Mr. 50 Cent." And the next person raises their hand, and it just snakes all the way down through the classroom with every single person saying My favorite musician is Mr. 50 Cent. And these people are all like 19, 20 years old. And as they're speaking, the teacher is getting more and more frustrated. He's like 25, 26 years old. And he goes, he finally comes up at the very end of the class and comes up and goes, I do not like Mr. 50 Cent. And I was like, okay, now we get a little discussion. Let's get into it. I was like, why don't you like Mr. 50 Cent? And this is a perfect example of like the American traveler being way outmatched for how real the world can get on the road. The guy pulls up his shirt and goes, Mr. 50 Cent has made all his songs about being shot with a few tiny bullets. During the war, I was hit by 2 rockets, and he had these massive scars the size of baseballs on his chest. And he goes, and I never wrote a single song about it. And that was one of the most like unintentionally funny, but also deeply jarring and profound moments that I've been a part of.
I mean, yeah, you can't really argue with him for that, by the way.
Yeah. Although I've told that story once and someone said, well, it's a hell of a story. He should have written a couple songs about it.
I was going to say that. I mean, well, he still could write one. Well, let's talk about this. Let's talk about something that I'm actually really fascinated with is your first book, right? Your novel, the Danger Gang series.
Yeah.
So originally it was set in Borneo, right? It's like a kind of a caper jungle mystery.
Yeah, the first book is set in Borneo, and it is exactly as you say. It's I always say when I'm talking to kids, I say, what happens to this kid here is what happens to most 10-year-olds, which is his parents got abducted by Borneo pirates in Borneo. And who hasn't that happened to? Happened to most kids 5 times this week. So his parents get abducted by pirates, and he goes and tries to rescue them with his fencing rival Julian Sato. And it allowed me, first of all, I've spent so much time in jungles that I knew I could describe jungles really well. So when I was setting out to write a book, I was like, just visually and sensory wise, I want to be in a jungle. And second of all, it allowed me to take some of these travel experiences and make them a silly caper for kids, Yeah. So it was a ton of fun.
Are there more of these to come?
So I just signed the contract for my 3rd novel for kids, which takes place in Oregon, actually. It's not part of this series, but it takes place in Oregon. Yeah, it should be fun.
Can you give us any hints to it?
It's called The Quest for the Ruby-Backed Turtle. Although I did see in the contract, my publisher was like, that could change. But right now it's called it's called The Quest for the Ruby-Backed Turtle, and it's about a boy who goes to search for a apocryphal turtle on the Oregon coast, which is where I'm from, and Oregon has a coastal wilderness that is the 4th rainiest place in the United States.
Well,
so I wanted to write a book that would really take place in like a rainy weather place.
Right. In Goonies, right? Goonies.
Yeah, very Goonies.
Oregon coast.
Yeah.
And by the way, I just
Goonies.
have to apologize to you and anyone listening. If you hear the gardener, I don't understand. Since we've all been in quarantine, I think the gardener has shown up every day for some reason. But anyway, if you hear that, we'll work through that. Well, I really want to point this out. Again, I mentioned that I heard your interview on Wild Ideas Worth Living, and I love what Shelby does. And I really loved how that episode with you were doing a live talk with the kids at a school that somewhere in Irvine, I believe. And you were so animated and having so much fun. And it was rad. It was really exciting to hear. And it was really great to kind of check out a little bit about the Danger Gang, and excited for the next book to come out.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. It was a fun one for me. And Shelby, actually, she's eternally tied to this next book, because in my speech to kids, I talk about what it's like to grow up with ADD. And I have ADD, but not hyperactivity. I have, focus-based ADD. I have a hard time focusing and staying locked in. And I've trained myself for years and years to improve my focus. But I talk about it with kids, and no one had ever asked me to comment on it publicly or talk about it in a bigger forum. And Shelby heard that bit, and she essentially made the whole podcast about that. And when my publishers heard it, they said, we would really like you to write a character who is struggling with something similar in your next book. So I have, and that's what this next book is. And Shelby's eternally connected to it. She's tied to it.
Yeah, I thought that was fascinating. Just someone like myself who does, been diagnosed and struggles with that. And like you said, I think a lot of us struggle with the focus and trying to find things that really work for you so you can execute on what needs. So really commend you for being vulnerable and putting that out there as a way to be helpful to kids and anyone else, adults, anyone who needs it.
Thank you. And I think, I'm sure you've had, potentially a similar experience, but the way that the world telescopes people who have attention deficit really comes into clear focus when we're out in the wild. Because there's this thing, and you're a surfer, so for me, I also find it very much with surfing that the world telescopes, because you actually like laser focus is like through the tunnel of distraction, right? So there's, up to a certain point, I can be more distractible than any human on earth. And if I can get through that tunnel, then I'm more laser focused than any human on earth. And that's what the waves do for us, right? They force us to operate in the moment.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. And it's, you actually just said something. It's like when you're out in the wild, you get to kind of shed all that other stuff and figure out how to be your best self. And it's these like 7 core principles I've been working on of like how to travel with meaning. And it's nothing about like crazy lessons or things that I've, secrets, but just little tricks or things that I found along the way from just talking to so many different people that organically come to the surface. Like these little things that everyone mentions that have shown up for them are just little tricks and things that I keep putting out of ways to hopefully use all that stuff to your benefit through travel.
Yeah. I want to have you lay those out on Up Rocks, if you don't mind.
I would be honored to. Well, let's do this because we both mentioned surfing a couple times, and I know you are a big water guy, and I want to bring this up because for me, I used to say that my success and my happiness, right? I used to say success for me was, oh, if I got you a deal or I sold you a TV show or blah, blah, blah. I based my happiness and my success off other people. It took me too many years to figure out that I'm truly happiness and I'm truly successful any day I get into a body of water. And for you, I know you're, again, a big surfer, but I know you love to just get in water. What are some of the unique watering holes you've been into in the world?
Oh my gosh, that's my favorite question I've ever been asked in my life. So I'm a cliff diver. I'm really into cliff diving. In a couple years ago, about 10 years ago now, I lost half my knee in northern Australia cliff diving. I hit a rock on the way in.
That sounds horribly painful, by the way.
It was rough. It was the scariest situation I've ever been in because I just about bled out. I was, I went into shock, and I'm 6'2" and 195 pounds, and I had a buddy who was, and he was with me, and as I was in shock, he carried me 2 miles to the car, and then drove for about 4 hours to get me to the hospital.
Wow.
So it was a wild one. With that said, I still cliff dive. I still cliff dived at that exact same spot just last year. I still love cliff diving. And so I've been cliff diving. One of the places I would recommend is Litchfield Park in Australia, is in Australia's Northern Territory. There is this hike. Oh my gosh. If you could turn your listeners onto this, this is like one of my most treasured things in the world. So there's this hike called Nipmuc Gorge, or it's called the Bachelor Trail. And on this trail, it's a 7-day trail, and you hike about 10 miles each morning. And each afternoon, you end up at this beautiful, pristine water hole. Now, the crazy thing about the trail is it's only open 4 months of the year. And for about 3 months of those, there's not enough water flowing for it to actually be fun. Like the water starts to stagnate, but if you can go during that 1 month of the year when the crocodiles have been taken out of the water and transferred to larger bodies of water that would eat you, right? You're in northern Australia. But then the water is not so so little that it's stagnant. If you go in that 1 month window, you
Where,
hike for 10 miles.
you said in Northern Territory, but like, where is this? Like in Kakadu, or where is this?
It's south of there in an area called Catherine.
Okay, got it. Yeah,
About an hour, 2 hours south of Kakadu.
Getting the
Yeah.
crocodiles out of there are probably key.
Yeah. So once the crocodiles are gone, and before the water starts to stagnate, you can have this situation where you're hiking 10 miles every morning. You start at 6 a.m. You're done by noon, and then you spend the whole day just reclining at the most beautiful water holes every single day that I've ever seen in my life. Cliff diving and swimming and going down rapids. It's just beautiful.
Wow. Surf.
So that's one of the ultimate ones.
Surf break. You still want to surf?
Oh man, so many. I would love to be good enough one day. My ultimate dream is, and I mean this on the most off day of the least competitive season on, but I have this dream project where I would spend a whole year, a whole season at Pipeline, and on my very last day I could take one wave there, just for the cultural significance of it. But a lot would have to align for that to work. I think the Mentawais are the number one place where I really want to like go on a surf trip. What about you?
That's a great question. I think I still want to go to Peru and surf the lefts down there. For some reason, I'm always just kind of fascinated and just love that. For myself, like I'm more like a cruiser. Like I would love to dream of thinking I'm pulling into a big barrel of pipe, but like that's not really going to happen. I'd probably even say Kelly's wave pool.
Oh, and by the way, not me either. Definitely, I'm talking about like a 2-foot day at Pipe where it's blown out just to say I was at Pipe or whatever, you know.
I surfed Mavericks by saying surf Mavericks. It was like 3 foot, super small, but Jeff Clark took me out. Jeff Clark took me out, and like so to be there and like to kind of say I surfed, it was super cool. But like, I'm fascinated and just like in awe of the big wave aspects, but I want nothing to do with being in the lineup.
But there's so many different layers in surfing. Kelly actually took me out at Trestles the day before the contest, and I remember I couldn't catch anything. I was with him and Bethany Hamilton. I couldn't catch anything because everyone was so good. And he finally paddles up to me and he goes, just drop in on me. And I was like, no, I don't think so. This was before he had all those injuries and he was like still in the world title chase. And I was like, that doesn't sound like a great idea either.
Yeah, because I'd be the guy who'd be like, drop in. I'd be like, sure. And somehow I took him out and like it'd be a horrible
Exactly.
thing. That would be me.
That was my thought.
Sure. I don't know.
That was my
thought. I had Reef McIntosh on the show, big wave surfer, like
of
the year, just telling stories about catching those huge bombs at Pipe. Just
oh my God.
Well, let's do this. I think it's time for one last question is, what does travel mean to you?
I would say that travel means the chance to recognize that all the world is inside of you and you are inside of all the world. And what travel does for me is it makes me feel incredibly large in that I'm self-possessed. I feel comfortable. I feel at home in my body. I feel like myself. And yet it makes me feel incredibly insignificant in that I am just a microscopic piece of a giant world inside of a giant universe, right? And I think that dialectic between feeling big and powerful and feeling minuscule and insignificant is one of the things I love most about travel.
Dude, I love that answer. Well played. Well played.
Right. Thank you so much.
It's time for the speed round.
I'm ready.
All right, we're going to put about 60 seconds or so on the clock. We won't really be judging you too much on the time, but we're still going to start a timer now. What is your current country count?
Did I say 65 earlier in the call? I think it's that.
Place you still want to visit?
Still want to visit Malawi.
Place you tell people to visit?
Madagascar.
Mountains or beach?
Beach.
Airbnb or hotel?
Hostel. Uh,
Window or aisle?
Window.
Boat or train?
Boat.
Scuba dive, skydive?
Scuba.
Kindle, hard copy?
Hard copy.
Sunrise, sunset?
Sunset.
World Cup, World Series?
World Cup.
North Pole, South Pole?
No one ever says North Pole. I want to say North Pole.
Do you collect anything from your travels?
Yes. Let me see. Let me grab like coral sometimes. What else? Let me see if there's things with like little shells with stuff growing on it. Anything insignificant. You know, these are called rosary peas. They're little beads that you find places. They have did you ever see Breaking Bad?
Yes.
Breaking Bad features ricin. Rosary pea is 70 times stronger than ricin. The poison inside those is 70 times stronger than ricin. Little things like that, you know, poisons, shells.
Okay, yeah. Favorite travel book?
Oh my God. Oh, wait a sec. The electric Kool-Aid acid test. I bet you haven't got that answer.
No, I have not gotten that answer. Do you get travel insurance?
I do. I did. That time I told you I broke my knee, a $4 travel insurance policy, $4 paid out $60,000 Australian.
There you
I
go.
was in the hospital for a month and a half.
That's crazy. The thing you need on a flight?
Thing I need on a flight? Nothing. I'm a pretty easy flyer. Bottle of water.
If you could live in one time period, what would it be?
The golden age of piracy, 1720.
Well done.
Most egalitarian time in the history of humanity up till now.
Favorite national park?
Masai Mara National Park, I would say.
Favorite airline?
Favorite what?
Airline?
Ooh, good one. Emirates. No, Qantas. Qantas. I love Qantas.
Favorite hotel?
Oh man. This is a great question. Favorite hotel? I feel like I'm just gonna kick myself afterwards. Castellano Tabiano in near Modena, Italy. In Emilia Romagna, Italy, it's a giant castle, and it happens to have some rooms that you can rent. It's insane, and it's not that pricey at all. $175 to stay in a castle.
Favorite food?
Favorite food is I had these zebu skewers in Madagascar. Zebu is a type of steak. The meat tastes really iron rich. Zebu's got a big hump on its back like a camel, but it's a cow. It's a Malagasy cow. I had those. They cost 10 cents each. They continue to be, and I've written about food for 20 years. They continue to be the best bite of food I've ever had in my life.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
Favorite place in the world?
I mean, after Oregon, where I'm from and where my family is and where I fell in love with the wild, Madagascar and Australia are the two places that I'm the most in love with.
Well done, man. Thank you so much. Tell everyone else where they can find you.
You can find me online. I have Stephen Bramucci, StephenBramucci.com. You can find me at Uprocks, where I'm the editorial director of the Life section. You can find me on Twitter at Steve Bram, on Instagram at Steve Bram, on Instagram at Uprocks Life. Yeah, you just find me wherever. Find me out on the road. That's where I want you to find me.
Hopefully we'll
Find me in the surf.
All right, people, make sure you give Steve a follow and definitely be on the lookout for that upcoming new kids book and a lot of great adventures coming up as well. All right, people, see you on the open road. Peace.